the idea of this particular piece of work really came to me in the latter part of the 90s, when I had been quite deeply involved in a range of different forms of women's organizing in Zimbabwe on a range of different sort of thematic areas or issues. And the thing that really started disturbing me as I came to the end of the 90s was that there were a number of people who were writing about that particular period in Zimbabwe. Most of them were men. In fact, I think I can hazard to say all of them were men. And when you looked at their analysis and their critique of that particular period in relation to women's organizing, women were completely invisible. And that kept bothering me because there was a lot happening within civil society at that time. There was a lot of organizing taking place. It was a moment where really civil society was coming together, working around issues of constitutional reform. There was the birth of a new political party subsequently. And so there was a lot of organizing that was going on that built upon work that had been done in the decade of the 90s. But in terms of the written record, women were really nowhere to be seen. And I had lived through some of the most vibrant women's organizing in that period, and I couldn't reconcile the fact that I had lived through this, and yet it was not being reflected in any of the written narratives of that period. And so by the time I reached the end of the 90s, after quite deep organizing with women through the Women's Coalition on the Constitution, through a range of different organizational alliances that the Zimbabwe Women's Resource Center and Network had spawned and was part of, I really felt that I needed to take a little bit of time out to reflect on the work that had been done in the period of the 90s, but also to write. And so at that time, Amina Mama was taking over the leadership of the African Gender Institute, and I knew that it was very, very important politically for me to be located on the continent to do this piece of work. And so I remember very clearly meeting her here in Zimbabwe. She at that time was doing some work for the Zimbabwe Women's Resource Center Network in terms of documenting their organizational, her story. And that's when our paths crossed, and we had quite substantive conversations about writing and about her story and women's narratives. And I was excited by the fact that she was going to be in Cape Town and really wanted to work under her and with her on this particular piece of work. And so that was really the genesis, I guess, of this particular piece of work. And so I relocated to Cape Town and worked from the African Gender Institute in writing this story. I think the first set of challenges that I met was really around voice and identity. I mean, as you know, race politics plays out in very, very particular ways in Zimbabwe, and it's reductionist. It becomes reduced to the color of the skin, and that hooks into very, very complex nationalist discourses around race and identity. And here was I, somebody who looks like this, wanting to document women's organizing at a time when land invasions were taking place, and the meaning of what it means to be black meant a claim to certain kinds of things, certain kinds of narratives, certain kinds of histories and stories. And so I really wrestled with that. I wrestled with the fact that I was going to be documenting this, I was going to be writing this, and what right did I have to do this? And I really felt that it was important to surface, even at that early stage, the voices and narratives of a number of different people, a number of different women, as a means to weave together a story or a narrative. So it wasn't just my voice, but I was bouncing off of and being in conversation with a range of different women. Of course, a master's degree is a very, very specific thing, and this piece of work was done towards a master's degree, but also with the intention always of it being a catalyst in some way and an offering to the women's movement in Zimbabwe, to sit with, to wrestle with, to unpack, to challenge, to discuss and debate as a history or a her story, to tear apart and to put together again. And so when it came to the compliance for the masters, it became very clear that I needed to limit myself in terms of how many people I engage with. And I guess at that point I chose people who I had worked with, who I had traveled the road with, and who were accessible in that moment. Because at the time that I was doing the research, many things were shifting and people were moving in different directions. It was 2003, 2004. Many people, the first wave of activists leaving had already taken place. And so it was grappling with, those sets of things. It was grappling also with issues of safety and security at that stage. What does it mean to engage in conversations with activists who I was trying to create a space to talk in the fullness of their experience about politics, about the meaning of social transformation at a time when activists were being arrested. And so it was really for that reason that I chose within the manuscript to not name people, or to not attribute quotes to particular people, but rather to use the word conversant, which also for me went back to this initial idea of having a conversation and weaving multiple narratives together to tell the story, almost like a tapestry. So that was that. I mean, the piece of work was done. I spent almost a year doing that weaving and coming to terms with, what it means to do this. And then it was submitted, as a master's, and that sort of brought that arc to a close in some senses. The one thing that really did sit heavily with me was the latter part of the thinking, which was around the offering to the women's movement. And there were different ways, actually, in that intervening period from 2005 all the way through to really 2011, when I used the piece of work to facilitate other conversations. So, one of the first gatherings of the Feminist Political Education Project, which was really a formation or a coming together of key women who were involved in organizing in the 80s and the 90s, but in the 2000s were scattered all over the place, but still felt that, they had something and we had something to contribute, particularly around the negotiation process, with regards to the global political agreement. And at the first meeting, we constructed a timeline in order to remember where it is that we came from, in order to know better, how to strategize and how to move forward. And I remember drawing very, very heavily from this particular piece of work to facilitate, you know, that part of the process. So there were many different spaces and times where that particular documentation was used to facilitate other kinds of processes, but it was always something that, you know, was hanging for me in terms of how it is that this gets shared more widely. And I think in 2011, in Brighton, actually, of all places, at the Institute for Development Studies, we were having a strategic planning, something known as a cross-regional dialogue that brings together all of Just Associates, staff, and allies and friends to think collectively, you know, about a particular theme or, you know, a particular strategic move. And Irene de Bell from HIVOS was part of that meeting. And we had a range of different conversations, including, you know, work that HIVOS was wanting to support in Zimbabwe around knowledge and knowledge production, particularly with women's organizing and women's movements in this country. And over the next couple months, we continued that conversation, and Irene asked if she could read this manuscript. And so I sent it to her, and she became very excited by it and really felt that it was something that needed to be shared. And so it was almost a moment by the end of 2011 where it was dusting off, you know, the manuscript and really coming back to it with different eyes, and really seizing the moment and the opportunity to be able to share this more widely. And I was very, very aware at that moment that my life had shifted. I was no longer based, you know, within the academy. I was now the regional director of Just Associates Southern Africa. That came with a huge load of responsibility and work, and that I wouldn't have the time really to go back to the manuscript and substantively revise. And that also sat heavily on me, because as people we change, as people our analysis changes over time, and there was really 10 years that had passed. And what does that mean in terms of telling the story? But I decided, after consulting a number of people, that it was okay. It was a document that was written and produced at a particular moment in time. And it was a document that, in that moment, and given that version of me, was as integral, I guess, to that process. And that there was still value in this particular piece of work and in this offering. And so I made the decision that there would be very minimal changes to the manuscript, and that it would sit as an offering, that it is one version of a narration or a telling of the her story, and there are multiple other versions. Every single moment that I chose as a key moment in that story to explore the complexity of the issues that women were facing at that moment in time could actually be another book. Because every moment can go as deep and as wide as you would like it to go. And so, with all of those contradictions and all of those tensions, I think the book, as it has been supported by Weaver Press and by HIVOS, to take the form that it currently is in today, is really about that for me. It's about saying, here is one version. It is not complete. There are millions of women who, in big and small ways, have contributed to this history, who have been activists in their own right in rural and urban settings in this country, and whose stories need to be told. And the invitation is that there are many other people who are interested in this narration, in building this story, in building this canon of work on women's organizing in Zimbabwe. And the invitation is for them to add their voices, to speak to other people and do the kinds of work that can contribute to this collective narrative. And really, I mean, as I sit here on the eve of the book launch, we are trying to enact that at the launch. So Eva Joyce Wynne, who was key in the late 80s and all the way through the 90s and you know, the early 2000s, Toko Mache, the same, you know, was one of the key women activists of that time, have agreed to join me in telling that story. And I imagine that there will be many women in the audience, you know, tonight who participated at different moments in the organizing work and who have stories to tell in and of themselves. And so I'm really hoping that, you know, this will spawn a whole range of parallel and intersecting narratives as a means to really challenge mainstream knowledge production that writes women out, that because of the complexities of what it means to write and what it means to find the space and time and how difficult it is to actually publish, you know, that this is forcing an opening for a whole range of other stories to emerge.